Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. Now this is a little bit of a strange one. It is the first episode for the podcast that I've kind of purposefully filmed for YouTube, which feels a little bit strange because I have been literally sat here waiting to start recording for probably a good 10-15 minutes, which is so bizarre because I am so used to recording my podcast episodes and I've got no problem with doing audio only, but you know, there's so much conversation, isn't there? And so much kind of debate around should you be recording for YouTube as well, as in like, should you be doing the video or audio only? And I kind of thought to myself, do you know what? Let's just try with doing the video as well for YouTube, see how it goes. We'll do it for maybe like the summer months. And I don't know, we'll see where it takes us. I've not really got much of a plan for it, I have to say, but my point that I'm making is that it's just really weird how kind of nervous I was to just hit the camera and say record. So that's just like a bit of an interesting one. Today, what we are going to be talking about is how Apple Podcasts is going to be introducing episode-specific artwork for their podcast, which I think is really super exciting. I think there's some pros, I think there's some cons, but for this Tech Thursday episode, this is what I want to talk about. So if you're thinking to yourself, well, what does this mean? How I would compare the individual artwork for Apple Podcast episodes is just like having a thumbnail for YouTube. Essentially, you've got your artwork on YouTube, which everyone sees, which is your little picture, which is your brand, whatever it is. But then you have individual thumbnails for each of your videos. And Apple Podcasts are going to be introducing this for the podcast as well. So if you want to be having an individual picture, piece of artwork, whatever it is for a particular episode, then you can. Now, you don't need to panic if you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, this is another thing that I need to add into my workflow. Then no, you do not have to create an individual piece of artwork for every single episode that you're going to produce for your podcast if you don't want to. If you don't want to, then Apple Podcasts will continue to use your RSS feed and it will just continue to pull the podcast artwork, and it will just continue to attach that to every single episode. So you don't need to stress about that at all. But what's really, really cool about this is then it's just another way of trying to entice somebody into your episode. So when they are scrolling your episode list and they're seeing a whole load of episode titles, they're now going to have the potential for seeing the artwork, individual episode artwork as well, which you can really do something fun with. You can keep it just, plain, sweet, simple with a graphic of your guest maybe. You can maybe write in some sort of fancy font on Canva what you're talking about in the episode title, for example, or you can really go to town. And if you're into making YouTube thumbnails or something similar, you could do something like that for your Apple Podcast as well. So I think that's really cool that there's going to be this kind of opportunity there to display your artwork for your podcast in a different way. Now, as I said, some people might be thinking to themselves that this is just another thing that I need to add into my workflow. And I promise you, if you don't want to do this, then you don't have to. We don't have an exact date for when this feature is going to be rolled out as of yet, but it will be sometime later in 2023. So like I said, you don't have to start panicking that it's something extra to add into your workflow because necessary if you don't want to. So if it's seeming like it's too much hard work, then don't stress about it. But what I would say is if you're making individual artwork for your podcast episodes to share on Twitter, Instagram, whatever it is, then as long as the file size is fitting the right criteria, you might as well use that for your individual podcast episode cover as well. Or if you're on Canva, you can just resize it if you're on Canva Pro. And just to remind everybody, if you are creating podcast artwork, then you want it to be 3000 by 3000 pixels for Apple Podcasts. I mean, all of them are going to be 3000 by 3000, but that's what Apple Podcasts say for their artwork requirement. You can go down as low as 1400 by 1400 pixels, but I would say stick with the the biggest you can have is 3000 by 3000, and I would say just go with that, because then you're not worried about anything being stretched too much and anything going blurry. And then otherwise, when you're creating your individual individual podcast episode artwork, then it is just a case of sticking to those basic rules of making sure that everything is legible. You know, we all get drawn into using fancy handwriting fonts because they look pretty. I'm an absolute sucker for them as well. But if somebody is scrolling and they can't quickly see what your episode is about, then it is better to leave off the fancy fonts. And again, thinking about colours, what's easy on the eye and what stands out, but what is easy to read at the same time. So with all of that in mind, I would love to know, are you going to be using this new feature of Apple Podcasts? Are you going to be creating individual podcast episode artwork, or are you just going to not bother? And are you just going to stick with it being pulled from your RSS feed and the podcast artwork for the whole podcast just going to be used for every single episode? I am not 100% sure how I'm going to go forward with it at the moment. I have to say, I see the pros and cons, as I've already said, to both sides. I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to go down the route of individual episode podcast artwork, but at the same time, now that I'm creating the episodes for YouTube, then maybe once I create the thumbnails, then that's something that I might just resize for Apple Podcasts. As I said, I really have not decided how I want to take this update and offering from Apple Podcasts, but do let me know what you think. You can connect with me, Twitter, Instagram, @VeritySongon. Drop me a message. Let me know what you think of this new update. Oh, and I should say as well, if you're watching this on YouTube, because it is new, then please do comment, like, subscribe, all of that goodness. And if you are listening on the podcast, then make sure you're subscribed on whichever podcast directory you're listening on as well. Otherwise, I will see you next episode.